Hello, and welcome to the Professional Empathy Podcast. My name is Leanne Butterworth, and today I'm joined by Lisa Twigg to discuss the topic of empathy and dementia. Lisa is an independent social worker who has worked in a wide variety of inpatient and community settings. After caring for her father who had dementia, Lisa wrote a book called 80 Years Without Dementia, where she reflects on the life lessons her dad's dementia taught her, in the hope her family's story could support others. Coming later in 2024, Lisa's second book will focus on her father's end-of-life story. Today, we'll be learning about dementia and empathy for those with this debilitating illness, as well as learning about the experiences of the family members caring for a loved one with dementia. My name's Leanne Butterworth. This is the Professional Empathy Podcast. Welcome, Lisa. So lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Leanne. It's beautiful to be here.
This has been a long time coming. And so I'm really looking forward to learning from you today. So we're talking about dementia today. And first off, would you mind setting the scene for us? So what is dementia? I think there's a lot of sort of misperceptions and myths around what it is, what it's not. So would you mind please first telling us a little bit about what dementia is?
Yep. I'll preface that by saying I am not an expert in dementia. I am a daughter of somebody who lived with dementia. And I'm pretty much an expert in our family story.
Yeah,
but dementia there's currently more than 400,000 people living with dementia in Australia, and projections sort of moving forward over the next sort of 30 years, and estimate that is likely to double. So we are talking about something that is a growing health issue, but it's also obviously a global health issue. And there is certainly a huge amount of misunderstanding about dementia in the community. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of negativity, there's a lot of stigma. And I think that largely comes from a place of misunderstanding. And the other thing that I have kind of noticed over the years is that people don't actually understand what the terminology even is. So dementia itself is the easiest way for me to explain it probably is that dementia is an umbrella term. So it is a term to explain a number of other diseases which fit under that umbrella. And the one that people most commonly know is Alzheimer's disease. There are many other types of disease under that umbrella of dementia. Vascular dementia is probably quite well heard of as well, frontotemporal dementia. And there's a number of others that people, I guess, have heard of to a lesser extent. With my own dad, initially he was diagnosed as having vascular dementia. Now he had quite a long history of high blood pressure. Okay. And often there is, as the name would suggest, some kind of connection with issues around blood pressure, which was something that my dad had had. They later suggested perhaps it's actually Alzheimer's, or maybe it's even a combination of both. And that's the other thing, is that it can be difficult to differentiate between which disease it is, and they can coexist. So most people, I think, in the general community, think that somebody with dementia has trouble with their memory. And quite often they do. And that was certainly one of the indicators for my dad that there was something changing. But there are other symptoms that people see, but your average person in the community won't necessarily understand. And they can be problems with judgment, sort of processing information. I'll give you an example. So one of the things, it was before we actually did any investigating, but it was a good indicator that something was changing was with my dad. So he was a farmer. And anybody that knows anything about farming knows that fencing is kind of bread and butter for your average farmer. Like, they know how to do fencing. And my dad, had done decades of fencing. And then him and I were building a chook run in our backyard. And Dad was defaulting to me again and again for things to do with the wire for the fence, using the pliers, and just putting it all together in his head was actually quite difficult. And I mean, at the time, I wasn't thinking, gosh, has Dad got dementia? But I was thinking, this is strange that Dad is sort of struggling with this. So it was a good indication that a task that had been something that was well cemented in his head was the sequencing of events was starting to become a problem.
Yeah, right.
And those day-to-day kind of functions, and people, just a friend said to me the other day, I didn't really understand the extent to which my mum was struggling until I went and stayed with her for a few days.
Okay.
Because it's those everyday kinds of things that start to become problematic. Not everything, but they're, that's usually the indicator that people might be able to mask certain things, and they may still be able to do lots of their other activities of daily life that won't alert people to the fact that there's any kind of issue. But if you spend time in their company, then there's a lot of little subtle things that can happen, especially in the beginning. Communication difficulties, obviously memory difficulties is one of those things. And Dad used to say to me, not just me, to Mum as well, if you'd ask him something and he'd say, oh, gee, I used to know that, or I would have known that in the past, but I just can't recall that at the moment. So he had some insight, as people often do, especially in the early stages, that there was something not quite right, but
Okay.
none of us are thinking dementia at that stage. He went through lots of sort of neurological testing over a couple of years, which initially said he didn't have dementia. He was diagnosed as having stress-induced short-term memory loss. But after the second diagnosis, I was starting to think I'm not really satisfied with that diagnosis, because it was more than memory loss. It wasn't just that he couldn't remember things. It was that he was actually having difficulties with, some of the activities of daily living, or some of the things, like I said before, that he would have been able to do in the past, that was starting to become a problem.
By the sound of it, so dementia is this umbrella term that we use to describe a lot of different conditions. Is that okay? Like if we sort of say dementia instead of Alzheimer's, or if we say that somebody has, like you said, frontotemporal or vascular dementia, does it matter that we use the word dementia when somebody potentially has one or more different conditions at the same time?
I think the best way to think about it is, unless you know what the diagnosis is. So if your mother was diagnosed and you knew that she had vascular dementia, then you could say, my mother's got vascular dementia. Right. But if you don't know, or perhaps there's been trouble diagnosing, I think there's nothing wrong with using the umbrella term, because there's some commonality across which disease type it is. And dementia, I think for the lay person, it's okay to say, like I used to say to people, my dad's got dementia. I didn't say, well, we thought my dad might have had vascular and then we thought he had Alzheimer's. I used to say, my dad's got dementia.
Yeah. So in terms of our conversation, and in the general public, that's an okay, because I know that sometimes when we talk about different.
Say so, yeah.
Okay. So by the sound of it, it is quite complex, and it is quite differently presenting early on, later on, and then individually, whether it's memory loss or cognitive function or even executive function. Do people know? You said that your dad kind of had an inkling that there was something going on. Are they aware of what's going on for them?
Once again, I think I've heard this quote many times, and I heard it as recently as last week when I was watching a presentation, that if you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia.
Yeah.
And that is, simply the fact, or, it's like childbirth or any other thing, that we all have our own story, yeah, and we all have our own experience. So I can only talk for what it was like in our family. But yeah, as I said, I think Dad had some insight into, in the earlier stages, Dad had some insight into the fact that he had some decline. And the first time they went to see the neurologist, now this was, from memory, it was in the middle of 2015. He was officially diagnosed with dementia at the beginning of 2018. So this is 2.5 years before that. And he was told at the time, as I said, that he didn't have dementia, that he had stress-induced short-term memory loss. And when Mum and Dad came home from the appointment that night, Dad was very happy to be told he didn't have dementia, because at that point, he didn't know a lot about dementia, but he knew enough to know he didn't necessarily want to have dementia. And he was, I still can picture it to this day, we were sitting, because my parents used to live with us, or my mum still does. They have a granny flat underneath our house. So they were upstairs with us having dinner. And Dad was basically teary, you know, like they were tears of relief in his eyes when he was saying, well, he actually literally said, well, it's not the D word, so that's good. So he, at that point, had insight into the fact that he didn't want to be diagnosed with dementia.
Yeah.
By the time the next appointment came round, because that was a kind of, you know, check back in 12 months situation, and he was told again he didn't have dementia. And once again, he was quite relieved to hear that he didn't have dementia. So fast forward sort of 18 months or thereabouts when he was diagnosed with dementia, I think in that time or in that period, his own insight into his condition had changed.
Okay.
So that the diagnosis was not really devastating for him at that time, because I think he had lost already at that stage the emotional attachment to what a diagnosis would mean for him.
Yeah. Okay.
So although for me at the time, I wasn't surprised at all. Like it was sort of me that said, I'm not really happy. I think we should take him to a memory clinic, and that's where we got the, you know, the diagnosis. So I wasn't surprised at all by that stage that Dad had dementia. And I think it was sort of like there were there were times after that, many occasions where he would question something that Mum would say, or you know, there would be some reason why they couldn't do something or whatever, and Dad would be wanting to know why. And Mum would say, well, you're just not allowed to do that anymore. Driving is one classic example. You've got dementia. And he'd say, huh? Dementia? Like what, me? So it was totally lost on him that he had dementia. And it didn't then bring on, you know, tears and anger. He simply just like already move on from that conversation kind of thing. So in a way for him and in our family, by the time the diagnosis came, it didn't have the same devastating impact as I know that it has had in other people's lives.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I talk about this in the book, that when Dad was diagnosed, as I said, I'd kind of already probably decided in my own mind that he did have dementia. I didn't feel gutted by the diagnosis, because to me, he was still my dad. So it didn't really matter whether he had dementia or not. I wouldn't say it was obviously not irrelevant, because there were things that had to change after that, but it was just, I don't know, I just didn't feel like it was the devastating impact that someone on the other side of that situation might wonder why.
Okay.
And one of the things that drove me to actually write the book was that not often, but again and again, I would encounter somebody expressing pity or feeling sorry for me or Dad or Mum or our family in general, that Dad had dementia. And I used to think, I don't think Dad wants pity. Like, I don't think Dad would want anyone to feel sorry for him. He's still Bob. That's his name. He's still Bob. He's still my dad. You know, he still lives in our family. He's still part of our family life. So that was part of I guess, the motivation, though I didn't know at the time, to go on and write the book, because I wanted people to understand, and that's the subtitle of the book is actually Diagnosis Doesn't Define Life, because that's what I wanted people to understand. Just because you get a diagnosis, and in our case it was dementia, but that could be a diagnosis of, you know, many other conditions that, you know, people are living with. I wanted people to understand that just because you've been given a diagnosis, it doesn't mean your life is over. And it doesn't mean that you're not still the same person. Your ability to do things has changed, and your ability to engage with people will be different. And people can't relate to you, especially as the disease progresses, the same way they have in the past, but you're still the same person.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest, I guess, misconceptions, but tied up in fear,
Yeah.
that the community at large has about dementia, that the person they were is no longer the person that I'm living with. And that is true. Like as time progresses and their dementia advances, they aren't, because they can't be your partner or your father or your brother the same way they used to, but they're still the same person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it's that fear of aging, that fear of the unknown, that fear of the loss of control that really adds to the stigma and taboo and misperceptions around dementia?
I think so. And I think that, you know, we've been watching things on TV and movies and things for a number of, you know, for quite a few years now, which thank goodness, you know, do at least alert people to the fact that that this is a, you know, a growing health condition, and educate us a little bit about what it's about. But the reality of that is that those programs are, you know, they require an audience. So to some extent, you know, they have to be done in a certain way. And I think that in some cases has added to people's fear about certain things. But I think just our culture in general, you know, we're taught to sort of work all our lives until 65 and then retire. And that's when the real living starts. And, you know, then we get a caravan and we go off around touring. And, you know, that's what we aspire to. We should aspire to that for decades. So if you're then faced with the reality that your partner is, or your parents or whatever it is not going to be able to do those things, that's quite confronting for most people to consider, that the dreams that they had, you know, the things they've saved for, all the things that they have put aside thinking they're going to do, you know, in their 70s or into their 80s if they're in good health, all of a sudden they can't do those things anymore, or they have to change the plan. So I think that's another reason why we have a lot of fear, because people are projecting forward that they might have to give up their hopes and their dreams. And that's quite confronting for people.
Is dementia just an old person disease?
Absolutely not. Age is the biggest risk factor for dementia, but that doesn't mean that everybody gets dementia as they age. But if you live into your 90s, so my nana she died at 96, and she had not been diagnosed with dementia at 96. So as you get older, obviously your risk increases, because age itself is the biggest risk factor. But there is actually, and I don't really know a lot about this, but there is actually childhood dementia. And there is, you've probably heard, younger onset dementia, which can be diagnosed, you know, in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So it's certainly not an old person's disease, but it is most prevalent in people over 65. And as I said, age itself is the biggest risk factor.
Do we know, potentially this is one of the things that adds to the fear, is we don't know the cause or the cure. There's a lot of unknowns still. Is that right?
There's certainly no cure. There is a lot more known now about preventative factors. So for me, when Dad was diagnosed with dementia, one of the things I had to do was learn as much as I could about a disease that I didn't know really anything much about at that point. But I also wanted to have some understanding of what the future was going to look like for us, and what were the things that were coming, you know, possibly in the coming months, years. And I was extremely surprised to know, as are most people who I've spoken to about it since, that the cardiovascular risk factors are quite similar to what they are for dementia. So if you want to do your best to prevent cardiovascular disease, you know, you don't smoke, you don't drink much, you exercise, you know, you eat a healthy diet, all the things that we've been hearing from the Heart Foundation for decades. Well, those things now are being recognised as some of the most significant preventative factors. There are some others. So obviously keeping your brain engaged, so learning new things. I think that's another thing that's interesting to think about, is that most people have heard, if you don't want to get dementia, you do crosswords, or you do Sudoku.
Yeah.
And both those things are great, but your brain gets used to things. So ideally you are you're doing a range of different things that stimulate your brain. That might be music, that might be language, that might be puzzles, that might be crosswords, it might be Sudoku. So your brain needs to be kept busy and learning to do new things.
Yeah.
One of the other preventative factors, which is probably my favorite one to talk about, because I had no idea of this myself, is about connections and positive relationships. So people who are very isolated, perhaps might be very introverted, don't enjoy other people's company, don't seek it out, probably more prone then to some of the other issues such as maybe depression or anxiety, which in itself, those things are not good for your brain in the longer term.
Yeah.
But yourself, if you have a good catch up with somebody, or you go out and have a really good boogie, or your endorphins are pumping, you feel good, your neurons are firing, it's good for your brain. So the idea of people staying connected and hanging out with people that are positive and that they get their cup filled up when they see those people, that is good for your brain. And I don't think most people, they probably know that on an anecdotal level because we've all experienced it, right?
Yeah.
But to then start thinking about the positive impact on your brain, it's quite, I was really pleased to hear that when I heard that, because I am quite an extroverted person, and the people that are in my life that I love and adore, I love hanging around with those people. I love speaking to them on the phone because I feel good afterwards.
Yeah.
So I was really happy when I heard that.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's, as well as diet, as I said, smoking, alcohol, all those things, physical exercise, same thing. Good for your brain, gets the oxygen pumping through your blood vessels. Exercise is now starting to be recognised as a very good preventative factor for your brain. Doesn't mean if you go running every day, you're never going to get dementia. Because like anything, all these things, they all form part of the picture. They're all about, like, the best case scenario is a whole range of different things that you can do. But there is certainly more and more work now being done on the preventative factors. And they're really not anything, they're not rocket science. They're the same things that we've been told about, largely they're the same things that have been told about health and fitness for decades, know.
And it feels like it makes sense, because even when we talk in the stress and cortisol space and the impact that cortisol has on our body, in the going for a walk, 5 minutes of exercise, talk, like naming our emotions, talking to somebody empathetic, deep breathing, all of these things that clear cortisol and reduce those levels so that it can't have that negative impact on our body and our brain as well. So that all makes sense.
It makes so much sense. It really does make so much sense. Yeah. And I think,
and sleep.
And sleep. Oh, sorry, that's one of the other key ones that I should have mentioned is sleep. Yeah. And, cholesterol, looking after your cholesterol, blood pressure. Once again, all the cardiovascular kind of factors. Yeah. They're very similar to the other preventative factors. Yeah.
Is dementia something you die with or die of?
Dementia is a terminal illness.
Okay.
So that's, I think, another thing that people maybe don't kind of realize, is that it actually is a terminal illness. And once again, I'm not a neuroscientist to go into a lot of detail about how that happens, but from a practical point of view, it affects your brain, and your brain has the ability to, move your arms and speak and all the other things. So as your brain is deteriorating over time, it will reach the point where it will just naturally shut down. So my dad passed away in November, and he had some other sort of health issues, but at the time he died, he had no overriding health conditions. So he had lived with asthma for most of his adult life. He had COPD, so respiratory condition. And we kind of expected that it would probably be pneumonia or something like that that would end up, ending Dad's life. But he basically died
Oh,
with dementia and from dementia. His body just naturally shut down, the same as it was. In fact, I've actually just finished writing my second book. And one of the things I noted in there was, and I remember, so we took him out of a nursing home and brought him home to die. And that's basically what I've written about, because it's quite unconventional to do that. And I remember commenting to my husband a couple of days after Dad got home that there was no dementia anymore. Because by the time we brought him home, he was what's called bedfast, so immobile, basically. So all the previous behaviours related to being able to move around, and there were lots of them, they were gone because Dad was now simply laying in his bed.
okay.
He wasn't talking much anymore. And what he was saying was, fairly quiet and not always coherent. So the constant asking of questions, repetition, all those sorts of things had gone because he was coming to the end of his life. The changing of clothes, the moving of things around, the shadowing mum everywhere she went, all that stuff, it didn't happen anymore. So by the time he got home 6 days before he died, he was just an elderly man at the end of his life.
Yeah.
The same as he would have been if he'd had no dementia, really. Probably one of the major differences was that he was not able to communicate with us whether he had any pain verbally. And that is the same for not just Dad at the end of his life, but I suppose other people that are still speaking and still quite coherent with their families until quite close to when they die might have been able to report pain better than Dad was able to. So that was just looking out then for the other cues. So, did he ever grimace when we went to move him, or, were his facial expressions suggestive of the fact that he needed pain relief?
Yeah.
But otherwise, yeah, there was no dementia by the time he died.
Yeah. There's a beautiful quote in your book, and you say, there is still a person inside a dementia diagnosis, and that person still has needs and feelings just like everyone else. Continue to include them, show them kindness, give them time, demonstrate empathy, be tolerant, stick up for them when they need you to, keep their best interest at the center of your intentions, and just be there with whatever needs to happen. That feels so profound, because I feel like if we forget that bit, and then you hear people use the word deal with, we're dealing with a disease, which feels very different to caring for a person, caring for your dad. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that sort of little summary that you just read out sort of says it all, really. Like, human kindness. There's another reference I make in the book to the COVID pandemic and when it started. And, when in those first few months when the whole world was starting to shut down and everyone was going, what is this? And, our whole lives have been forced to change. And the catchphrase kindness matters, every time you listened to anything or looked at anything, there was kindness matters. It was on billboards, it was on signs, it was all over the place, encouraging people to be kind to each other because everybody was struggling. Most of us were in unknown territory, had not been through a pandemic before.
Yeah.
And people were encouraged to treat each other with just good old-fashioned kindness. And the reason I mentioned it in the book was by the time I wrote the book, which was 12 months ago now, the pandemic had been declared over, but the need for kindness had certainly not been declared over. It's just one of those things that costs nothing to be kind to people. It's for those of us who are parents, it's, you want your children to grow up being kind. So you try to demonstrate when they're around kindness. You encourage them to be kind to each other if they've got siblings. It's not that, once again, it's not rocket science and it's not that hard. And I think if people keep kindness and compassion and obviously empathy at the center of what they do and who they deal with, whether that's you, me, my dad or anybody else that lived in the nursing home where he was, if you keep that at the center of your role with people or your interactions with people, I think you can't go wrong, really. Like, people don't necessarily expect you to understand everything about their situation. You can't know what it is like for them in that moment or on that day. We're not seeing their point of view because we are not them.
Yeah.
But the one thing you can do is just treat them well. You can treat them the same as anybody else that you would come across. They might answer differently. What they say back to you might not make any sense, or they might not answer you at all.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you need to lower your standards and treat them any differently.
Yeah.
And I know you've had a guest on before who's talked about aged care, and I think we all know some of the systemic challenges in the aged care system. And once again, I write about those in my current book. But I do want to say that where Dad was, so we put Dad into care about a bit over 2 years before he ended up dying, and that was largely to save Mum.
Okay.
Because the carer role is full on when it comes to dementia. And I was starting to observe that my mum was, and I'm not speaking out of turn, this is all written in the book, that my mum was losing her natural kindness.
Okay.
She's a naturally kind person, but she was losing some of that because she was so stressed. She was so sleep deprived. Dad was up, again and again every night, and this went on for months. And I thought, I'm actually going to end up losing my mum as well as eventually my dad. And, I had to step in and kind of call time on Dad living at home, which is the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
Wow.
But I think that if you observe in somebody else, and as I did in observing my mum, and I know from talking to other people that they have observed this in their parents or their colleagues or whoever it is, that their own capacity to do what they have always done and act in a way that they always have, if that is starting to be compromised because of carer burnout,
yeah,
you're going to do the best thing for everybody to change that situation. Because when Dad then went into care, and by that time Dad was actually settled from day one in care, which not everybody is, and we were grateful for that. But the staff that that looked after him, I mean, once again, systemic issues, workloads, lots of agency staff and whatever, but the core staff that were there with Dad, some of those people looked after Dad the whole time that he was at that nursing home. I suppose to some extent these people have chosen this vocation because of the kind of person that they are. And their ability to be kind to Dad and the other residents, is refreshing. It's obviously necessary, but it's very pleasing to see if you feel that Dad is in a place where people are looking out for him, they are dealing with him with compassion, and the other residents, and they are, I guess, normalizing. I don't really like using the word normalizing, but they're just seeing the person for who they are, not the condition that they might have been told that they had, whenever that was. So once again, I've kind of forgotten what your question was now, but I think it just comes down to the basics of just treating people, remembering they are still the person that they always were.
Yeah.
And once again, I write in the first book, the book I wrote about Dad's dementia, that there are situations, and there was in our life, and I know there has been for other people, where not everybody around them is able to maintain a relationship with them because it's too difficult for them.
Yeah.
And that was something that I struggled with for quite some time. I had a lot of anger about that issue on a few occasions because I couldn't understand. think because Dad was so vulnerable,
Yeah.
you know, the more advanced his disease was, the more vulnerable he became.
Okay.
And I think I struggled to understand how anybody could sort of exclude him or
Yeah. Okay.
not want to see him or not want to maintain a relationship with him, because I guess that just didn't make sense to me. It didn't fit with how I had always seen his situation. But it was actually Mum who made me realize in the end that I dealt with Dad's dementia in my way.
Yeah.
And I had personal and professional skills that enabled me to do that. But other people have dealt with his dementia in their way.
Yeah.
And I can't judge them for that. And I can't say that's wrong. I simply have to accept that, you know, we are all different and we all have our own coping strategies and we all have our own capacity to deal with the unknown, the fears.
Yeah.
So that was a good lesson for me,
Yeah.
that my way of dealing with things is not necessarily wrong or right. It's my way of dealing with things, and I can't expect the same of everybody else. I'd like it, but you can't. Other people have their limitations,
Yeah.
which impact the way that they deal with not only dementia, but, you know, many other things in
Yeah.
our lives that some people just simply can't understand and therefore don't want to go near. It's too hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess that I guess reinforces when we're talking about interacting with a person as opposed to interacting with a disease or a condition. When we want that certainty, we want to know what's going on. We want to make things better. We want to do the right thing, say the right thing. That then feels like it would be easier then to focus on a condition because that's knowable, as opposed to focusing on somebody that we don't know anymore. And you're sort of saying, well, focusing on the person and the kindness and they are still the human being that we knew. It's just they're presenting slightly differently and taking the focus off the condition, off the certainty, off the needing answers and fixing, and back onto the messy, vulnerable individual that you have in front of you, where there are potentially no answers, but that's where connection lives.
That's right. And once again, the simple things, touch, you know, smiling at people, including them, you know, a hug.
Yeah.
Once again, it's nothing that's rocket science about that. It's just good old-fashioned communication, connection, relationship, all the things that we're all very good. We're getting better at, all of us, at talking about these things. I suppose it's just bringing them back down to a practical level and saying, you know, when we talk about connecting with people, this is what we mean. This is what we mean. This is connecting with people, you know. Hold their hand, put your arm around them, you know, take their hands, look them in the eye, smile at them. There'd be times when, you know, especially in the sort of later stages, where Dad would be home for lunch and just focused on eating his food. So by that stage, he wasn't interacting, like talking a lot to us most of the time. But nevertheless, he still enjoyed being at the table. And if we were all sharing funny stories between us and we're all laughing our heads off, then sometimes Dad will look up and he'll laugh as well. Well, he wouldn't have understood what we were laughing about by that stage or what the joke was. But it doesn't mean he can't pick up the emotion of the situation or enjoy seeing us laughing and it makes him laugh. You know, it's those kinds of really simple things. I think they don't change. Just put him a place at the table, give him his food the same as everybody else, and life just goes on around him, you know, as it did when we had him home in those days and he was dying. Life went on around him. We all came and went out of the room constantly, the kids, the dog. Inclusion.
And it's like you said a minute ago, the people that you spoke with who are, oh, that's really sad, and the pity and sympathy and all those sorts of things, that's not what they want either. That's not what your dad wanted. He didn't want, by the sound, but people to feel sorry for him or pity him or pander to him or any of that.
No.
And yeah, that pity and sympathy, and that doesn't fit in this world. It just doesn't feel like it has any benefit in this world of that space.
No, I don't think so. And well, for me, it didn't. Anyway, I can't, as I said, I can't talk for what other people felt. But for me, I didn't need anybody to feel sorry for me, because looking at the bigger picture, Dad's dementia has actually now changed my entire projection. So, you know, from that experience, I wrote a book. From that, I'm now out talking to people and talking to groups. From that, we brought Dad back out of a nursing home, brought him home to die. From that, I've written another book. From that, I'm changing my work scenario. Like, it's actually the whole thing, and I don't want to trivialize it, but I think the point that I want to make is that Dad was always an optimist. He was always an optimist, and he encouraged us, myself and my brothers, to look at things in a positive way. We all have knockbacks. We all have hard times. He had plenty. But dwelling in negatives was something that Dad was not interested in doing.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of why I say I didn't need anybody to feel sorry for me. You know, Dad was, hence the title of the book, 81 by the time he had dementia. He had 80 years before that, hence the title of the book, when he did not have dementia. So the relationship that I had with my dad, and this is obviously different if people are diagnosed at the age of 35, 45, 55, but for me personally, if my dad had dementia for the tiny little last portion of his life, so be it.
It didn't define him.
It did not define him, and it didn't define my relationship with him, nor Mum's relationship with him, which, you know, they'd been married for more than 60 years by the time Dad died.
Yeah.
So it's very important, I think, that people just don't assume that you want sympathy or that you want pity. Maybe some people do in this situation, because it sucks for some people. For me, I didn't need that. I just needed people to be okay when I brought Dad with me, when we went places and I had Dad with me, and he might say something inappropriate here or there. I just needed that to be okay. That's all I needed.
And it would make sense. Like, there's so many emotions that go along with this. And it would make sense that people would be okay with this new phase, but at the same time grieve the old phase, the person that is gone, because that is a change and that potentially is a loss. But it feels like what you're saying is not being stuck on that and still celebrating the person in front of you, the memories and the strengths and the abilities that are still in front of you, and not dwelling on the grief of the what has been lost. Is that right?
For us it was, or for me it certainly was. So there's certainly plenty of grief and there is plenty of loss. And I think particularly for the person who may be the spouse, so in my mum's situation, for example, there was plenty of grief and there was plenty of loss. But by the time Dad got to the point where he was ready to die, I think Mum was resolved on those things, because, not that I can speak completely for her, but I think that she reached also a point of being able to accept that this was their situation. And as I said, she has been able to, she still lives here, so she has been able to observe and vicariously be part of anything that goes on now from here, which is Dad's legacy.
Yeah.
And that for me is the most wonderful thing of all, that we now have a legacy. We have more than one legacy now of Dad.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the most important thing for everyone, because Dad continues to teach people what I think are some of the most important lessons that we should all learn. We might be the conduit for that, but the learning comes from Dad. And for me personally, that keeps Dad alive in my heart. That's a way that I can continue to show love for my dad.
Oh, yeah.
even when he's not here anymore.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
I feel very grateful and privileged for that situation.
Do you think that those qualities, the optimism and the positivity and acceptance in a way helped you through the caring journey? So if we sort of turn around a
Oh,
little bit, what
definitely.
it's like to be a carer of somebody with dementia?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I was not in the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week carer role that Mum was, because they live downstairs and we live upstairs. And obviously I've got children of my own, so I wasn't the 24/7 carer. But I think it did allow me at times to try to help Mum to see something from a different point of view. And I think Mum and I have always had a good relationship, which obviously helped, especially when it got to the stage where I had to say, Mum, you can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
And, that was obviously an extremely emotional couple of weeks as we went through that process of preparing to put Dad into care. And the same week that he went into care, they went into lockdown. And
Oh,
I didn't see Dad for, I think it was 3 months or something by the time I could see
oh,
him again. It was devastating
ow.
because, yeah, it was hideous. But thankfully for Mum, and this is something I will be forever grateful for, is that the nursing home he was at, which is 5 minutes from our house, I don't think they were the only one, but they had an initiative called Partners in Care.
Okay.
Because they were facing their own drastic staffing issues. You could, as each person was allowed to have a family member, and I think it was often a spouse, who could come up. Mum could go every day, and she pretty much did go every day. She had to go in full, PPE,
Yeah.
but she was allowed to, because they were trying to keep all the residents apart, which is very difficult in the dementia area, but she was allowed to just be with Dad. And the idea was that she helped him with his meals, she could help shower him, dress him, and just be with him because they were really desperate for staff. So the good thing about that was that for the rest of us, that we knew that Dad was okay, because pretty much every day, at least for a number of hours, Mum would see Dad. So
Yeah.
that made it all much more bearable for us. And from the organisation's point of view, I guess they probably had no choice in a way because of the situation they were in with a lot of their staff. But I think it showed, to me, that did show empathy, kindness, and compassion, because
Yeah.
there was a recognition that not for the first time people are living in lockdown. By then, we'd been seeing for months on our TV screens, the deaths in aged care and whatever. So I think they recognised that something had to change. But from the family's point of view, that was a complete gift for us that we were able to do that.
For people who are still at home, so they haven't gone into aged care, for people who are caring for loved ones with dementia at home, what sort of supports are available? Like, what do people need? What do they need more of from the community? Are they well supported? Like, what's that experience like?
Once again, I think that's a very individual thing. On the whole, I think you could make a generalised statement and say that the home care packages and home support services that are available are still, despite the money going into them, under-resourced for the growing need. And people are living longer. I think this is one of the interesting kind of, almost, it's not really a contradiction, but we've been encouraged a lot over the years to stay at home. This has been the messaging in aged care, is that people should live at home for as long as they can. And I agree with that. It's not that I think that's wrong. But what it did do in our situation, mind you, we were in a pandemic at the time, which changed it as well. But I think one of the things it did do was it put additional pressure on Mum, even if that was indirect pressure, because people should stay at home. We should be able to look after people living with dementia from home. And all the unknowns in the pandemic about, Mum wasn't really very keen on people coming in and out of our house during
Yeah.
the pandemic. Some of the sort of practical difficulties of, trying to get consistency with carers that would come to take Dad out. There was all kinds of issues around all of that stuff. So It's not always straightforward. There is, I think, the messaging within sort of dementia is that people should try to get as much support as they can, because it's well recognised that carer burnout is real, and it is very difficult as the disease progresses to care for somebody at home. I would say almost impossible with no support, but it gets more difficult as time goes on. And it is important that people get respite, they get breaks, they get the opportunity to go and do different things. So mum went away, interstate, my brother a couple of times, dad went into respite facility a couple of times, used to go to a day centre, once or I think twice a week in the later stages.
Yeah.
So all this stuff is extremely important, but it is difficult, I think, for people to accept they need help, reach out for help. And then if the help that they get is not what they imagine or doesn't go as well as what they would have liked, I think it's easy to say, I knew this wasn't going to work, and go back to go back to doing it myself. And it is an extremely challenging disease as things progress. And for us in our situation, it was no longer an option to have dad at home. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had to make the decision.
By the sound of it, so the advice by the sound of it is for people who are caring, it's yes to get as much support as you possibly can for the person, to help with the person who has dementia, but also to get your own support and make sure that you have outlets and hobbies, and you don't lose yourself in that carer role as well, so that you can avoid the burnout and keep doing the things that you want to do in order to, I guess, live your life and take care of the person that you love.
That's right. And I think once again, bringing it back to the beginning of life, like when we're new mothers, we're encouraged to, still make time for yourselves. We all know that's almost impossible in the early stages, but nevertheless, we're encouraged to do it, like take a night out with your friends, or go to the gym, or, put the baby in the pram and go for a walk when they're asleep so you can have some time on your own. It's really very similar for somebody who is caring full-time at home for somebody with dementia.
Yeah. And oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, there are helplines. There are 24-hour helplines. We rang them a number of times. Mum had some counselling through one of those helplines a couple of times. Yeah. There is lots of things that are available to you, sort of even at a distance, if you're not quite at the stage of inviting care into your home, or sending your loved one to a day centre or to respite. There are things that are at a distance where you can get advice. There are carer support groups that you can reach out to and have some of your, I guess, your feelings and your experiences validated.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're not quite at the stage of, inviting people in a little bit closer.
Yeah. And that would help, I guess, both ways. It would help you, but it would help you provide better care, because you provide better care when you're not burnt out, when you are supported, when you are optimistic and happy. And
that's right.
Then your loved ones have better outcomes because you're in a better place, because that whole, I have to do it myself, nobody else can do it as good as me, actually doesn't work as well. It's like, even when we're new mums, not like
exactly the same. Yeah, exactly the same. Yeah.
So, and
if you're stressed and, because your baby's crying, they're probably going to continue to cry until you can bring down your own emotions. And people living with dementia are no different to that.
Yeah. And it's not selfish, and it's not a weakness, and it's not a failing, that you take care of yourself and that you get as much support as you possibly can, and you find your people and you find your groups and you talk to people who go, yeah, like, we are here for you. You do not have to do this on your own. Like, that is, and it's people even outside your family who
definitely
have that objectivity, who can really, I guess, put the wind in your sails. And
and it's so important that once again, beginning of baby's life, we're encouraged to join mums groups, where we can share our experiences, just offload. No one's going to judge us, all those things. Same for people that are living with dementia or cancer or whatever the other conditions might be. The sense of connectedness and the safety and security of being able to perhaps say the things to a stranger or somebody in a group that you can't even say to your own family. Like, there were things that mum was able to talk about with the counsellor that she probably didn't want to talk about to me because I was part of it. Like, part of the thing was that I wrote in the book that one of the things, probably the only thing really, that I experienced any guilt about was nothing to do with Dad. It was actually to do with Mum. Right. So if Mum was getting annoyed at Dad, or I thought that she had dealt with something inappropriately, and I'd say, Mum, like, you can't talk to Dad like that or whatever. And then I'd feel terrible afterwards. Or I'd ring one of my brothers and say, my God, Mum's blah, 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 blah. And then I'd feel terrible because I knew that she was under a huge amount of stress. I knew how hard it was. But at the same time, I knew how vulnerable Dad was. And it was pressing my buttons to see Dad, who probably it was just, going over Dad's head. But for me, it was hurting in my heart. And so I think Mum was able to talk to people outside of me and say, and it doesn't feel any better when my bloody daughter says to, da, da, da. So it works both ways. It works for everyone. Absolutely. Everyone needs to be able to pop the cork and, invent. Yeah. And that's the benefit of being able to reach out and get support.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, it is then preventative for your own dementia, as we said.
That's right.
This is such an important topic. And like you said, the numbers are growing. The more we know about this, the more we talk about it, the more we accept the people who are experiencing dementia, the more we embrace the people who are caring for people with dementia. I guess there is no downside to this. There is only downside to stigma, taboo, judgment, distancing and dismissal. Yeah. So the more we can talk about this, and your book is a beautiful, beautiful way to start those conversations and to have that insight that we don't see in real. I mean, we see the movie Awakenings, and we see the elements, and we see the bits on the news, but to really get that personal insight, I think, is so powerful for so many people who this might not even be on their radar. Maybe your mum's in her 70s, not even on the radar yet, but to know that it's not something to stress about, to be scared of, that if and when it happens, there are people and supports and lots of love and optimism that can go around this, that makes me feel better. That makes me feel
absolutely. And it's what is motivating me now to get out and share our story, because as I said at the beginning, I am not an expert on dementia. I am not an academic in the field, but I'm pretty clear on our story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm very confident sharing our story, and I actually am really enjoying sharing our story. When I've spoken to various groups, and I'm actually going over to Western Australia next month on a speaking tour, and I've got all sorts of things going on at the moment.
That's amazing.
And that's what's driving me, is to just try to break down some of the stigma and dismiss some of, not dismiss, dispel maybe some people's worries, because people will remain worried about it no matter what I say or anyone else says.
It's scary.
But once again, just bringing it back to the simple fact is of just, they are still a person. They are still the same in lots of ways. They might not be able to do and say the things that they said before, and your relationship with them will adapt. But at the end of the day, we don't need to be terrified. And I think a lot of people have reached out to me since I published the book. And the one thing that just warms my heart every time is, I think, I might have just made a difference to that one person or that one family. And like, that's a pretty nice feeling. So it is what's driving me now to share our story more, because I think we all need to be doing our part.
Yep.
To normalize is maybe not the right word, but just to talk, open up conversations. It's okay to talk about it. It's not that you don't want to say that word to anybody. It's okay.
Yeah. Lisa, thank you so much for today. If people do want to find you and book you and read the book, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
So I started a Facebook page called 80 Years Without Dementia, which is the name of the book. The Facebook page is where I post, things that I might do, or things that are coming up or whatever. So people can follow that page if they are interested. The link's on there for how to buy the book as well,
Okay, cool.
as they are also on my own website. And I also am very open to people emailing me, Lisa at 80yearswithoutdementia.com.
Beautiful.
And open to people asking questions or getting me to come and talk or whatever, because this is what I see that I want to do from here on, and it's actually really exciting.
That's very cool. You're doing amazing work, and thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. So my name's Leanne Butterworth. This was the Professional Empathy Podcast. Today we were talking empathy and dementia with Lisa Twigg, who wrote the beautiful book 80 Years Without Dementia. That's today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us.